Okay, so as usual, we are in Duties of the Heart, right in here, and we are in Shar Yichud HaMaaseh, which is the gate of wholehearted devotion of all of your acts to God in chapter 5. And for those of you who have this edition, either in the large version or the cute version, we're on page 496, 497. And in the Safaria, it's in the chat, and we're in section 30. So we've been talking about the wiles of the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, and how the Yetzer Hara will try the various ways that the Yetzer Hara will try to trip you up. And we had a whole number of them, right? Coming from making you question your theology, to question prophets, to question the scripture, to questioning everything. And now finally we come to the last of the desperate attempts of the evil inclination to lead us astray. And it says, when the evil inclination despairs of raising doubts in our minds about all that has been mentioned, because up until now it's been kind of intellectual. It's been, you know, it's been a kind of battle between the between the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, however we understand that, and we talked about it before, this nafs, this lower inner self of ours, and our higher inner self, the seichel or the intellect. But now it's going to take an entirely different direction. It says, when it despairs of raising doubts in our minds about all that has been mentioned, it will make us lazy in the practice of God's service and preoccupy us with our worldly interests, eating, drinking, dressing, riding, and enjoyment of the various bodily pleasures. Okay, I guess if you lived in medieval Spain, medieval Spain, riding must have been a big thing, and of course we know that dressing was a very big thing, right? It's very they wore all sorts of beautiful fancy brocades and all sorts of things, very colorful dress in Andalus. And says you get involved with that. Remember, he's also writing to a pretty well-heeled bunch. Many of the people who would be the Arabic speaking readers of Duties of the Heart would have been people who were working in the courts of the Muslim kings in Spain, and they were living a pretty good life. I mean, it was a very if you're a high government servant, you have a pretty good salary, you're dressing well. Of course, you have to be, proficient in the arts of the court. You have to be able to read and write poetry. You have to be able to do all sorts of various kinds of artsy things. And of course, you have to be able to ride and all those things. And so he's talking about people who are living well. If we listen to it in respect to food, without which we cannot live, the evil inclination will make superfluous luxuries appear attractive to us and endear us to frivolity and pleasure, so that we envy kings and their ministers and wish to emulate them, adopt their customs, and follow their practices in pursuit of pleasures. And this is, I guess, relevant to us in our world, right? Where we can get easily obsessed with all of our various kinds of entertainments and pleasures, and become foodies, and people become obsessed with all sorts of things, and those things can distract us from things which are more important in life. So when it sees that you are willing and eager to do so, it will say, gird your loins, bare your arms, O easily misled man or woman, strive with all your strength, O beguiled human being, to serve the world and its people. Maybe then you will attain some of your desires in it. Do not perform any deed for the next world unless it's advantageous to you in this world and makes you popular with its people and leaders, with both the rulers and the common folk. Remember, in the very, very beginning of this section, he indicated that the very definition of wholehearted devotion to God was not caring too much about what other people think. And so now he's kind of smoothing back. He's smoothing back into that, and he's saying, so the evil inclination will now put you in the world and say, listen, look, there's all this great stuff. Work, work for whatever the world. And you know what? And if it's good for you in the world to come, that's great. That's good. If it's going to have some kind of eternal benefit, that's good. But don't do it for that reason. Do it for the reason that you're going to get credit for it in this world. And people are going to look at you and they're going to go, wow, oh, look at that. He's got a beautiful, he's got a beautiful horse. He's got a beautiful, beautiful car. And he's, got a beautiful, he's got a beautiful life. As Mr. Trump said the other day, we're going to wake up and we're going to be, we're going to be happy. Everybody's going to be happy with their life, and they're going to wake up, leap out of bed, right? So you can be happy with your life, leap out of bed, go to the job you love. Everything's going to be perfect. And so you should imagine, and then everybody will look at you, and the rulers and the common folk, everybody will look at you and go, wow, unbelievable. Unbelievable. So do not apply your mind to any field of study unless it brings you honor from your contemporaries and wins you the esteem of the notables of your time. Prince, officer, captain, anyone who occupies a high position. Studies worth cultivating are knowledge of language, essentials of prosody, principles of grammar and poetry, learning charming riddles, profound parables, and exotic speech. Right? So you should, occupy yourself with the kind of things that would be really good for medieval cocktail parties, right? If you're going to a medieval Andalusi cocktail party, this would be the kinds of things you would talk about, right? You would be reciting poems, and you would be discussing different kinds of meters and things like that. Those are the kinds of things that people talked about, and you could impress people with your knowledge of grammar. And so these are all things which people were impressed by in those days. Nowadays, I'm not sure exactly what it would be. I'm not sure what kind of knowledge people are impressed by. Anybody have an idea? Like what I don't know, what nowadays, like when you go to a cocktail party, what are people awed by? Neuroscience, maybe? Is that a thing? Or
Pop psychology.
pop psychology? Okay.
Yeah, they like the language.
Okay, so if you could, speak eloquently about pop psychology, if you could tell good jokes, it says here, charming riddles, that'd be tell good jokes. A good joke is always good. So do not be silent so as not to be considered a simpleton and a fool. Ignore the other studies, for they demand much effort and offer little advantage. So don't really devote yourself to things which are really cryptocurrency. Exactly. Thank you. Yes, cryptocurrency. If you, yes. And yes, and books on how to get riddle books and books on how to conduct small talk, right? Read the books on flirting or whatever, right? People know what to do. But if from the first, okay, he says, look, and the serious stuff is great, but it doesn't really give you any advantage, right? If you become a master of, quantum physics or geometry or, theology or none of that's going to give you, like that's not really going to be great at cocktail parties. So don't bother with stuff like that. Okay, go with the stuff that's gonna give you gonna make people impressed with you. But if from the first we do not open the door to these passions and do not gratify the desire to indulge in luxuries or to pursue them, if we answer the evil inclination that superfluities are not needed. Now he uses this word superfluities, motarim. And elsewhere in the book, he says, and I repeat this a lot because it really struck me, that he says that one of the main principles of spirituality is to know the difference between what is an essential and what is superfluous, between what you need and what you want, right? There's a very big difference between those two things. So he says, if you make a decision, you say, okay, I'm not going to involve myself with all these things which are superfluous. The thought we must devote to our livelihood and distraction is enough, right? I mean, listen, we have to make a living, right? We have to make a living. We have to deal with life. We have to go to the supermarket, right? We have to make dinner. We have plenty of mundane things to think about, right? There's no lack of mundane things to think about. It's not like any of us lack distractions. There are certainly plenty of distractions. We're never going to run out of them. So we don't go out to add more of them. And that if God should provide us with superfluities, with extra things, not distraction or diversion to us, we will use them in the proper way as we should. Sometimes, of course, sometimes, of course, we do have extra things. It's not like there's no luxury in life. There is, right? There is. And if we have those things, we should still use those things in the most appropriate ways, as we should. But if he does not provide us, we will make do with the basics and nothing else. Then the evil inclination will be broken and defeated. If you can say to the evil inclination, listen, I'm going to be okay with whatever. I'm going to be okay with whatever I have. If it's more than enough, great. I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it in the best way possible. If it's just enough, okay, I'm going to make do and I'm going to be fine. And so the carrot on the end of the stick, right? The carrot on the end of the stick, offering you some more is no longer going to be more. It could be material, it could be attention, it could be, your status and so forth, all of that stuff, right? None of it's going to mean anything if you're able to say, okay, I'm okay with what I have, with whatever status I have, whatever economics I have, I'm okay. But if we listen to it in these things, we will descend step by step until it leads us to destruction in this world and the next. So if we go down this path, it's just going to take us further. That the stick just gets longer and longer and longer. The carrot gets farther away, and we keep following it and keep following it until we end up wherever we end up. So the above are examples of the first kind of temptation by which the evil inclination induces doubt in a person if he is weak in wisdom and knowledge of God and his Torah. Okay, so this is like a normal person, right? Normal people, most of us, are not big. We're not big scholars. We're not big spiritual athletes, right? We're not, right? We're not particularly wise. We're just normal people. But if a person is proficient in knowledge of God and his Torah, the evil inclination will try to bring ruin upon him and to introduce error into his thinking and practice by way of objections or arguments from any available source, reason, scripture, or tradition. The evil inclination will support its arguments with fantastic proofs in which premises are not true and conclusions do not necessarily follow. This is, of course, one of the dangerous things about scripture, right? One of the dangerous things about having access to all these religious texts is you can use them to make all sorts of arguments. And so you may think, okay, here I am a big scholar and I'm in the books, right? But it's very easy for your Yetzer Hara, it's very easy for your evil inclination to lead you astray while you're in the books, right? While you're in the books. So if you can think clearly and have a strong grasp of the art of demonstration, methods of defending a position in the course of a debate or disputation, you will catch the various flaws of the arguments and proofs of your evil inclination. The truth will become clear to you, the right view will be obvious to you, and your thought and practice will be free of doubt and confusion. So if you're really smart, you're going to be able to outsmart even your evil inclination, right? You're going to look at its arguments. It's going to arrange the text for you, right? It's going to line up text for you, and you're going to and bring you into all sorts of horrible conclusions. And if you're really smart, right, you can outsmart it, and you're gonna be able to discern. You're going to be able to discern the flaws in its arguments. However, if your mind is not capable of this, the evil inclination's persuasive power over you will be all the stronger. It will overcome you more frequently and rule over you and overwhelm you outwardly and inwardly more quickly because it approaches you logically and leads you on by the method of demonstration, which you find so convincing, right? Because if you're a person who's logical, right? If you're a person who's very into physical passion and luxuries, okay, the Yetzer Hara will take you in that direction. But if you're a person of intellect and a person of knowledge, a person who is concerned with logic and so on, well, then it's very easy for the Yetzer Hara to twist logic in such a way that it can really convince you. And when the evil inclination seduces your mind, seduces your mind will desert you. And your mind will desert you, meaning is your intellect will desert you, right? It can no longer help you, right? Your only help against the evil inclination in this issue, right, is when we outsmart it with the intellect. That's your only hope. But if the intellect is overcome, then you're in big trouble. It says, and in which case it will make use of it against you as you rely on it when you are in doubt and trust in it when you do not understand the meaning of something. So it will essentially replace your intellect. It will pretend to be your intellect, right? So how do we outsmart the arguments? So Linda asked whether Bachya believes in philosophical argumentation. Of course he does. Yeah, he certainly does. And I think that, and we'll see later, he actually takes us into like a Socratic, if you remember before, I think we did before, the Socratic dialogue, right? With the intellect, between the soul and the intellect, right? So we can answer the Yetzer Hara with our intellect as long as we don't disable the intellect, right? It's possible for the intellect to become disabled. And once it's become disabled, then that for lack of a better word, that crooked thinking, thinking of a Hebrew word, it doesn't quite translate into English. That kind of twisted thinking, now becomes what we consider to be our intellect, and is now making our decisions for us. So the part of us that we want to make decisions is now offline, right? It's now gone offline, and we're allowing the Yetzer Hara to start now make our decisions for us.
Can I ask one question? I hate to detract from the conversation. One thing I really have a lot of problems with is the influence of Greek philosophy on Jewish thinking, because it seems to me that there is such a fight going on within the academic tradition, whether to give it credibility or whether to reject it entirely. And is there a difference between, let's say, Jewish logic? I've seen a lot of arguments which were philologically based, where one took a look at a concept that was as it was used in many different contexts, and then try to deduce some kind of explanation from that, as opposed to, let's say, the kind of logic that we see in argumentative traditions in Greece and in Rome.
Well, the answer is yes and no. So I'll give you the answer of the Maharal. Okay, the Maharal asked this question. The Maharal of Prague was a scholar, or Yehuda Loew of Prague, who lived in the 16th century in Prague. And he was asking this question. He has a question actually in relation to Hanukkah, right? Because in relation to Hanukkah, one of the questions he asks, he says, well, like, why are we getting so worked up about Hanukkah? Hanukkah is like the creeping in of Greek culture, when Jewish philosophy is full of of Greek thinking, right? Jewish philosophy is full of Greek thinking. The rabbis themselves used a lot of Greek terms. And it seems like Greek ideas kind of have infested or have like crept into a lot of Jewish thought. So he answers like this. He says, that's true. He says, but there's a fundamental difference. He says there's a fundamental difference. And he says the fundamental difference is in the way that we approach objectivity. So he says like this. He says the Aristotelian approach to objectivity is and this you can kind of see this if you're interested in like animal classification. Okay, so Linnaeus, right? Kind of animal classification. We take an animal, right? We take a thing, and we look at it from one direction. Okay, we look at it from one direction, and we determine based on our looking at that thing from one direction, kind of what are its characteristics. And we say that constitutes a species, or that constitutes a class, that constitutes a genus, that constitutes right? Based on observing from one perspective, from one point of view. So he said the Jewish approach is very different, because when we look, for example, at the argumentation of the Talmud, very often what you see is a constant pivoting of positions, right? Because you'll often get two absolutely different opinions, right, with no solution. He says, well, how is that possible? He says, that's not possible by Greek logic. By Greek logic, that can't happen. By Greek logic, right, we start at the top, right, in a geometric proof, and we end at the bottom. So we come up with one solution. We could do various things in the middle. We could do different operations in the middle, but we're going to come out to the same end. How is it possible that we can come out to different ends? So his answer is that we have a perspectivist viewpoint. If I had a coin back in the days when people used to use coins, I could do this easily, right? If I had a coin in my hand, right, and if I was holding it flat, right, it would look circular, right? If I hold it a little off, it would look oval. If I hold it flat, if I hold it straight up, it's going to look like a line, right? Now it's the same coin, but I'm looking at it from three different perspectives. So he says that's how we can come to different conclusions. So he says, on the one hand, Jewish thought uses universals of logic, right? Uses things which are universals. Hold on one second. So uses universals of logic, but at the same time, uses them completely differently, right? Uses them in a kind of in a more perspectivist kind of way. A little bit like if you've ever seen how they film fight scenes in movies, right? You have the two guys fighting in the middle, and then you have all the cameras around, right? And they're all filming at the same time. And then the way that you put together the scene of the fight is by making a montage of all the different angles of the fight. And so he says that's how Jewish argumentation works. Does that make sense? Okay.
I mean, it helps me understand why so many Jewish philosophers were involved in literary theory, in the undergirding of literary theory in the last 40 years, precisely because of this multi-perspective approach.
Right. I mean, I think
once the subject is a unity dissolved under the impact of modern post-war literary criticism, then we see this happening, the transference from religious thinking to secular thinking. Yeah.
Well, if Jacques Derrida had accepted my Shabbat invitation, we would have talked about this, but he didn't. So I once took Jacques Derrida to the post office. That was my daughter and I took him to the post office, and I invited him for Shabbat dinner, but he didn't come. So his loss. Okay. She says, thus your intelligence will become an evil for you, and your intellect a means for your undoing. As it says in scripture, because now the intellect, right? Now the intellect and the evil inclination, right, have now kind of joined forces. They're now kind of entwined with each other, and they're indistinguishable. So your intellect is a means for your undoing, as it says in scripture, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and imagine themselves clever. It's from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah. For they have rejected the word of God. What good is wisdom to them? And says, for the ways of God are straight and upright and walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. It's rough here. This is rough territory because on the one hand, like our salvation is in the intellect. Right? Our salvation is in the intellect. It's the intellect that saves us. It's that seichel, it's that higher mind. And yet he's saying that it can also become a stumbling block for us, right? I mean, that line from Yeshayahu, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes, imagine themselves clever. It's pretty heavy. Hoi hachamim be'enechem. It is exactly what it says. It says be careful about kind of over trusting your own intellect, and that leads me to ask questioning. Are there other ways of knowing? Are there more intuitive? Are there more intuitive ways of knowing? He puts a lot of emphasis on this idea of the seichel, of this idea of the intellect. And here I can see where there's a weakness in the intellect, right? Because the intellect can be outsmarted, right? Anybody who's smart can be outsmarted, right? So is there a way of knowing that cannot be outsmarted? So think about that. So it is said that wisdom, when used in the right way, is a remedy for every ill. But if one veers off course with it, it becomes a disease that spreads through the entire body, for which there is no antidote or cure. Right? There's nothing more dangerous than a bad idea. Right? There's nothing more. A bad idea. A bad idea is, it's like sourdough starter. You don't need much. You don't need much, but it can do a lot. So hence the Torah is compared to fire, as it says, it is not my word like fire, for like fire it enlightens the eyes with its light, as it says, God's commandment is pure, enlightening the eyes. Your word is a lamp to my feet, a light on my path, but it burns with its flame whoever turns off its path. This theme of light versus fire, of light versus of fire being light, both light and heat, is one that comes up many times. Rabbi Nachman actually talks about it also. But here he says that the very thing which can be light for us, which can enlighten us, which it can also become fire to us, right? We can also get burned by it. By the very same mind that can lead us to all these wonderful places and can give us such enlightenment, we can also put ourselves into some very dark places. So it burns its flame, whoever turns off its path. For what God, and he quotes from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, for with fire God executes judgment. He will rain down burning coals on the wicked. That's from Tehillim, from Psalms. And finally from Yirmiyahu, from the prophet Jeremiah. If I say I will not mention or speak anymore in his name, then his word lodges in my heart like a blazing fire shut up in my bones, right? And bones, it's not just your physical bones, it's the essence of your being, etzem, right? The very essence of your being. So your all of you goes on fire. So be careful, therefore, not to stray in your step from the ways of the fathers and the path of the early ones into unjustifiable innovations, relying only on your mind, consulting only your own opinion, and following only your own conjecture. And this is an argument that's made all over Jewish thought. That on the one hand, we really trust the mind, and we trust the intellect. And as I think I mentioned last week, Rav Sadia Gaon said that if you had a perfect mind, if you were a perfect genius, and you had all the time in the world, you would be able to arrive with your own intellect at the entire Torah by yourself, right? You would be able to arrive at it, right? Through your own logic, right? If you understood everything about nature and everything about human nature and everything about, you would come to, you would write the Torah yourself. But it says, if that's not the case, right? If we don't have that, the only thing we have to rely on for good behavior is what we know is good behavior by looking at the behavior of the people who went before us, and not constantly trusting whatever it is that our brains come up with, because our brains can come up with some things which are pretty dicey, right? We can come up with some pretty dicey things, and so he says, don't trust your own conjecture. Don't distrust your fathers regarding what they have handed down to you concerning what is good for you, and do not contradict the views they teach you, for there can be no idea that occurs to you which they had not already thought and weighed its consequences, both positive and negative. And I think this is a very traditional Jewish view, that don't assume that you're smarter than the people who went before you. Don't assume that you're smarter than people went before you. Don't assume that they haven't thought of everything before you. This is not an easy one for me. I have to tell the truth. I can't. I'm an anti-authoritarian by nature. It's just it's built into me somehow, and it's difficult for me to relate to this. But nevertheless, that's what he says. And also, I also, when he says that there's nothing that they didn't know that we know, I'm not always sure that that's true. It seems to me that human knowledge does grow in some sense, and I'm not gonna go of that too easily, but I hear it. Says you may recognize the positive in a certain opinion in its initial stage, while the negative consequences, final stage, remain hidden to you, so that with your lack of deliberation, you will see what positive in it, but fail to see its error and liability. Of course, that happens to us all the time, right? We have an idea, and we sort of have an idea. It looks pretty good in the beginning, but we're not looking very far into the future. We're not kind of looking at where it's going, or we're not looking clearly at where it's going, and so that can be a problem. So as the wise one said, do not move back the world's boundary which your fathers established. Says, listen, my son, to the instruction of your father. Of one who deviates from the customs of his father, he says, there's a type of person who considers himself pure, but is not cleansed of his filth. And finally, there's a type who curses his father, the eye that mocks the father. The idea is that we should be, right? We should be respectful of the opinions and understandings of our ancestors, and not get attracted to, and not become attracted to the innovations that may come up in our own mind, because they may have a logic that we may not be seeing the end from the beginning. So, questions from Linda. He says, are there limits to the application of logic? I think so. If we're told to do something destructive, like destruction of Amalek, do we follow the logic if we think the results will be destructive? You have to ask me about Amalek. Thanks for making my day today. No, I mean, it's a good question, but I think he would say yes. But once again, you'd have to look at everything that our ancestors said about Amalek, right? So that there's a commandment in the Torah to destroy the ancient enemy of the Jewish people named Amalek, which is a tribe that attacked the Jewish people. Now, but everything, well, what did our ancestors say about that? They said, well, the Torah says to do that, but we can't identify who Amalek is, and we shouldn't be randomly calling people Amalek because it's irresponsible and dangerous, and we don't kill people for nothing. And so, so we'd have to listen to that advice too. So I guess ultimately the advice of our ancestors on the Amalek issue would be to set it aside, because it's an impossible mitzvah to fulfill, and anybody who thinks it's possible is likely making a genocidal mistake. So
I guess I'm also asking the question, we're dealing here with the work which seems to be laying out, at least in my imagination, the principles for Jewish ethics. And Batya is using the intellect as a tool in helping us accomplish that. But then you come up against the great faith issue. God told me to do this, and I don't care whether I normally think it's good or bad. I'm going to do it. And yet, wasn't there a story that you told or I read recently where the person was told to do whatever it was that he thought was immoral? And even though the order came from Hashem, he said, no, I'm not doing it because it's immoral. And what happens when you're in a situation where you have faith on the one side colliding with your principles and your ethics on the other?
I think if you notice the trajectory that he has here, the trajectory kind of goes like this. He says your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination, will kind of entertain you with various kinds of theological doubts and things like that to kind of confuse you. Then it will bring you, then it will sort of like drag you into an over preoccupation with the world and with all the kind of extras in the world, and you'll be following you'll be chasing the carrot. It says then if you're really an intellectual, right? If you're really an intellectual, you're a big thinker, it'll start attacking your thinking, right? It's going to start attacking your thinking at a higher level and a kind of a logical level. And he finally comes to this as kind of like saying, okay, if you are overcome at that level, what you still have to hold on to is your faith. What you still have to hold on to is your simple faith in the words of the Torah and the words of the sages and the words of the prophets. That's what you have to hold on to, because you've disabled your intellect. Now, I would also say, I would say that there's other ways of knowing, right? The question of a conscience, right? Is there something like a conscience? Are there intuitive ways of knowing? Do we have levels of Ruach HaKodesh, levels of divine spirit that help us and inspire us? And that's a different question. He doesn't address that question. He says, listen, when we come down to the bottom line, and if our mind is confused, right, just hold on to what you know is true, right? And do what your parents did, and do what your grandparents did, and do what your great-grandparents did, because they knew what to do and they knew how to live.
Yeah, but he's doing this before the influence of Kabbalah is fully felt, and that brings in a lot of, well, to my mind, a lot of irrational elements into Judaism. This is one of the big struggles I'm having within my life right now, is defining my positionality in relation to Jewish tradition. And so if I'm taking a look at the Torah, yes, there's lots of stories, but you see the attempt to institute logic and order through the promulgation of the mitzvot and halacha. And and this is what he would be basing, I think. This is the position from which he would be speaking when he gives us that advice.
Right.
And if I have to position myself logic as opposed to faith, and I'm confused. But the faith itself has changed so much in the intervening centuries. So much more has been added. And how do I define myself? Would he give the
Yeah.
same answer to
No,
us today?
Good
if-
question.
if-
It's a good question. One wonders what did the Judaism that he was talking about look like? Because obviously our Judaism, the Judaism of now is, it's I think as Adin Steinsaltz once said that Kabbalah is kind of the official theology of the Jewish people. There's no place where Kabbalah hasn't reached, right? Our kind of mysticism has kind of really reached all these places, and the Judaism that he's talking about is probably a little bit different, than what we know. Although practically speaking, probably substantially the same, right? I mean, in terms of the mitzvot, in terms of substantially the same. But I think substantially the same, but with maybe a different way of understanding things, right? He's not understanding things in terms of tikkunim and sfirot and all of those things, but nevertheless, the kinds of things, behaviors he's talking about are more or less the same. But the idea of kind of depending on tradition, I think I think Rebbe Nachman also says that. There was a famous story that there were two people that they were studying they were studying one of his treatises, and he walked into the Beit Midrash, and these two guys were discussing with each other, and they were obviously like dopes. They were not brilliant scholars, and they're discussing, and his Torahs are very complicated and very difficult sometimes, and they're discussing it, and they're completely mucking it up. Anybody could see they're completely mucking it up. And he walked in, and they got scared. They were like, "Oh," and he said, "It's okay." He says, "With anything that I say, feel free to mess it up as badly as you want, right? Feel free to say whatever you want." He says, "But the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, try to get that right." Meaning to say, like, do the right things, right? Philosophy, Kabbalah, all of those things, that's one thing, but doing the right thing, that's it. So I'm going to stop there because we're beyond the time. Questions, other questions, thoughts, objections?
Yeah, I wanted to go back. This is rather Beshert that I haven't been here for a while. Beshert that this lesson focused on this thing about, respecting elders and the wisdom of the past, etc. Um, I think perhaps the thing about saying that everything they knew, we know, maybe not in terms of knowledge like science and stuff, but in terms of wisdom, I think, yes. Not to get a long story, but yesterday I got in a real big sort of screamy mimi argument with my 20-year-old grandson, who then texted me a whole bunch of stuff. Actually, I laughed at it, but you're just an old man with one foot in the grave. You don't know what you're talking about, blah, 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 blah. You know, and it's not a teenager. He's a little past teens, but still thinks like it. There's not a teenager on earth that hasn't said something like that to one of their elders, and yet we as older people can look back and say, well, yeah, when I was 18, I did that too. So some
Yeah.
things don't change. The wisdom of interacting with people, the wisdom of dealing with life, and my grandson will wake up to that probably in a couple of days, send me an apology. But the thing is I think that's really what's being talked about. There is a tendency of younger people to think that they are the know-it-alls, and what the older generations are thinking or saying and doing, that's all outdated, blah, blah, blah. And I think we've had that in every generation.
Well,
Yeah.
that's
So to maybe
Mark
that's what's being
Twain
talked
said,
about.
right? Mark Twain said that.
What?
He said, when I was 18, my father was an idiot. When I was 25, I
Yes.
realized how much he had learned.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody knows how to find me. You can hit me up wherever I am to be hit up. And thank you very, very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you guys next Monday or Wednesday or whenever it is that I see you. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Live long and prosper.